This is Flip Video 3.3, Fiscal Policy. So how does the government fix the economy? I've gotten this question quite a bit in class. So how do we actually fix problems? Do we fix problems? Yes, we do fix problems. We can fix problems. So there's three schools of thought in economics. The first is Keynesian fiscal policy, which is what we use in the US to correct the economy. And we try and change government spending and taxes to correct the economy. And then there's also no government intervention, schools of thought, that's broken into two different sub areas. There's the no intervention, which is from Frederick Hayek. He believed in no intervention, the economy should fix itself. And then we have the monetary policy school of thought, which is from Milton Friedman. He believed that the only people that should be fixing the economy is the Federal Reserve Bank through changing interest rates and the money supply. So in Unit 3, we focus on Keynesian fiscal policy, and then we'll focus on no intervention. And then Unit 4 will actually look at the Federal Reserve in a lot of detail and how they manipulate things to fix the economy. So we're focusing on fiscal policy, or we're going to rely on automatic stabilizers, which just means we do nothing. So automatic stabilizers are already built into the economy. They correct the economy itself, or we can actually physically force the economy to fix itself through fiscal policy. So we'll start with the no intervention here. In no intervention, the government doesn't do anything. So they just kind of sit back and relax. They are relying on things that are already built into our economy to bring us back. So they're relying on the business cycle to change taxes naturally. They're relying on the business cycle to change spending naturally. They're relying on the business cycle to change production naturally. So these are things that are just going to happen on their own. They don't need any assistance from the government. So a great example is when aggregate demand decreases. So this is creating a recessionary gap. The government automatically gets less tax revenue because GDP is falling. So as we are in a recessionary gap, unemployment's increasing. Well, if you don't have a job, how do you pay taxes? You don't. So tax revenues are going to start to fall because people don't have jobs. Your income is also decreasing, so your tax bracket's going to decrease as well. So we're having all of these decrease in taxes, which will naturally start to encourage consumers to spend more. Now, this is going to take a long time. We don't like the economy to fix itself or rely on automatic stabilizers too much because it can take a really long time for those to actually work correctly. So, but these kick in automatically, but sometimes they don't actually bring us back to potential output. They don't bring us back to long run because it just takes a long time. And, tax brackets don't just change overnight. You have to really spend a lot of years changing that tax bracket. And of course, it's great if you pay less taxes, but if your tax bracket decreases, that means your income decreases, which isn't, that's not the best scenario either. So we're going to spend the majority of this flip video talking about Keynesian economics, the use of fiscal policy, which is the changes in government spending and taxes to bring the economy back to potential output when it's experiencing an output gap. So all of our fiscal policy beliefs, the changes in spending and the changes in taxes, is all from John Keynes. So again, fiscal policies changes government spending and taxes, and we're going to force aggregate demand to close the output gap. So the only thing that fiscal policy is going to change is aggregate demand. This is not changing corporate taxes, this is changing income taxes. So we're changing the consumer's taxes. We're not touching short-run aggregate supply yet. We're just going to force aggregate demand to close. So why are we moving aggregate demand? Well, changes in spending and our changes in taxes are directly tied to our SIG-X equation. Remember that really important equation from Unit 2? Here it is again. We have to know the sig x equation. Super important. So when we start to change government spending, we are manipulating the G and sig x. So when we have changes to government spending, let's say we increase government spending. Well, that is going to increase our sig x equation. So if we increase anything in sig x, we're increasing G in sig x. That means sig x is going to increase. So if sig x has increased, well, what happens to aggregate demand? It will also increase. And the opposite is true as well. So that's how aggregate demand is forced to close the gap through the change of government spending. We can also change taxes. So changing taxes means that we're going to start manipulating the consumer spending. If we start changing your income taxes, then you as an individual are going to have more or less money based on that change. So the C in sig x is consumer spending. So let's say the government increases our taxes. What's going to happen to consumer spending with a tax increase? Well, it will decrease. If we're increasing your taxes, that's more money you have to pay to the government, so it's less money you have to spend. So we're going to decrease consumer spending, which will decrease our sig x equation. So what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand will increase. So that's how we're getting to this only aggregate demand is changing, because we're only manipulating things in our sig x equation. So we have two types of fiscal policy that are used. We have expansionary fiscal policy and we have contractionary fiscal policy. So expansionary fiscal policy is all about expanding. So which phase of our business cycle do we want to expand? Do we want to grow in or grow out of? Well, we want to expand or grow out of a recession. So we're going to be using expansionary fiscal policy to grow out of a recession. And then contractionary fiscal policy is all about contracting or making smaller. So what phase of our business cycle do we want to make smaller? Do we want to shrink? Do we want to lessen? Well, that's going to be an expansion. So we're going to be using contractionary fiscal policy during an inflationary gap. So let's go back to expansionary here. In expansionary fiscal policy, we want to increase government spending or decrease taxes. So why do we want to do that? Well, if we are in a recessionary gap, that means we're below potential output. So I'll draw my recessionary gap here. So I give you a visual. You'll have to draw these gaps, so make sure you're super comfortable drawing them and you know how to draw them correctly. Just remember that recessionary gap is going to be on the left of long run aggregate supply. It's reflecting high unemployment below potential output. It's that downward swing. So to fix this recessionary gap using aggregate demand, how do we get back to long run aggregate supply? Do we need to move aggregate demand to the left, or should we be moving aggregate demand to the right? Well, we should be moving aggregate demand to the right, so we can close the gap here. Here we go, aggregate demand 2. We're gone back to potential output, back to YF, and now we're at price level 2. So how did this actually happen? Well, we've increased government spending or we've decreased taxes. So how do I know that that's the correct thing to do to increase aggregate demand? Well, let's start with the increase in government spending. If I increase government spending, that means we are increasing sig x, which means we have increased aggregate demand. Do we want to increase aggregate demand to close the recessionary gap? Yes. So increasing government spending works. But let's say we decrease taxes instead. So I've decreased taxes. Taxes is directly tied to consumer spending. So if we have decreased taxes, what will happen to consumer spending? It will increase. If we've decreased your taxes, you have less money to pay to the government, which means you have more money to spend. So if we increase C, what's going to happen to sig x? Well, sig x will increase. And if sig x is increasing, what's happening to aggregate demand? That will also increase. Is that what we want to do to close the recessionary gap? Yes. Now let's look at contractionary fiscal policy. So contractionary fiscal policy is the opposite. Everything is flipped in contractionary fiscal policy. So we're going to be using this to correct the inflationary gap. So we'll go ahead and draw our inflationary gap here. Remember, this is the overexpansion. We're working too hard. We're overemployed. Our unemployment is too low. Whoops, on the wrong side. Fix all of that. Here we go. Long run aggregate supply. It's going to be on the left-hand side here. So our intersection is on the right. Here we go. Here's that inflationary gap. We're working way too hard. We're overemployed, overexpanding. We're worried about inflation issues. So we need to address this. So how do we fix this recession, this inflationary gap with aggregate demand? Should we increase aggregate demand or should we decrease aggregate demand to bring us back to long run? Well, we should decrease it. It needs to move to the left here. So here's aggregate demand 2. We are back to YF, and here is our new price level. So we know based on the graph that we need to decrease aggregate demand. So let's double check that our decrease in government spending and increase in taxes will work. So if we decrease government spending, what will happen to Sig X? Well, Sig X will decrease. So what will happen to aggregate demand? It will also decrease. That's what we want to have happen. So decrease in government spending works. Well, let's say we want to increase taxes instead. Well, if we increase taxes, what's going to happen to consumer spending? Well, it will decrease. So what's going to happen to Sig X? That will also decrease. And what will happen to aggregate demand? That will decrease, which is exactly what we want to do. So the increase in taxes would also work to close our inflationary gap. So that is how fiscal policy works. It's all about moving aggregate demand to close the gap. Now, there's some downsides to relying on just fiscal policy to correct the economy. One, it takes the government time to realize that a gap exists. It takes the government a few seconds to figure out something bad is happening. As we saw in unemployment videos, we noticed something bad was happening, but it wasn't addressed until a few years later, like the Great Recession. We noticed in 2008 something bad happened, but nothing was actually done until 2009 to address the problem. And even then, when something did happen in 2009 to address the problem, it wasn't actually even fully seen until 2012. So it takes a really long time for the government to realize there's a problem, for them to agree there's a problem, and for them to adjust. So it just takes a while. So by the time a decision has actually been made, a gap could, through the use of automatic stabilizers, correct itself. So there's some positives with fiscal policy. It's a little bit quicker than relying on our economy to fix itself. But the downsides to fiscal policy is it just takes a really long time for it to actually be enacted properly. So what's better? Should we use fiscal policy or should we rely on the automatic stabilizers to fix the economy? No one knows. It's up to you. It depends how you feel. Economists disagree about this all the time. That's why we have different schools of thought. We have the Keynesian school, and then we have Frederick Hayek and his no intervention beliefs. And they are solely separated on the idea of government intervention. Both have positives and both have negatives. There's really not a better preference for one or the other. It just depends on, what kind of situation we're going to have afterward and how we want to handle that. But it's a point of disagreement, so there's really not a correct answer about which one is better.